welcome back to the Gospel Light Radio Show. And once again, I had intended to continue my ongoing series that had gotten interrupted by coronavirus and the craziness around that. And, well, let's suffice it to say that current events have interrupted my regularly scheduled program again. As you probably know, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 2 weeks, we've been dealing with some civil unrest around the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police. This is a particularly interesting situation because this is not the first time something like this has happened. It is another in a long string of these kinds of incidents, but the nature of the incident this time, the egregious way in which he was killed, the amount of time that it took for the process to happen, the fact that it was caught on tape, the fact that there was nothing else going on in the news, all combined to give this particular story a lot more publicity than these things typically get. And that has caused a lot of activity, for lack of a better term, on social media and in the news for people to talk about their opinions, for people to be protesting in the streets. And, of course, protests give opportunities to riots and looting, and those things always accompany those kinds of activities. It's par for the course at this point. So when things like this happen, when big current events take place, it often causes us to ask the question, what is the church's response? What is the Christian response to these events? And you would think that the answer would be fairly obvious. But unfortunately, if it was obvious, I would not be talking about this tonight. The reason I'm talking about this is because there are people who seem to not go so far as justifying the injustice that takes place in this world, but be somewhat callous to it and believe that they are biblically in the right to have that attitude. And I think that is a problem for our message, a problem for our witness, a problem for our ability to speak to the world where they are and introduce them to the love of the God that we serve. So let's dig a little bit into the problem. I saw a post on Facebook that a friend of mine put up that said something to the effect that if Martin Luther King Jr. was marching right now, if the civil rights movement was happening right now, would Christians line up behind him? And he said, there's only one right answer to this question. There's only one possible answer to this question. And I told him, you would be surprised. Because I had another friend who is a minister in the church who basically said that if you had the idea to speak up or to march or to be any way involved in the fight against police brutality, that you are in sin and that you should be admonished by your elders at your congregation. And that seems, on the face of it, a little crazy. But if you examine his reasoning a little bit, then it seems more reasonable than it sounds at first. He's going to say, number one, that Jesus told us in Matthew chapter 5 that if someone does us wrong, Matthew chapter 5 verse 39, if someone strikes you, you should turn the other cheek. If someone wants to take your cloak, you should give him, or wants to take your sandals, give him your cloak also. We are not to retaliate against people who do evil towards us. Okay, we get that. And then he combined that with Romans chapter 13, that we should be subject to ruling authorities because they do not bear the sword in vain. They are ministers of God for vengeance against those who do evil. So we've kind of put ourselves in a box now. If we take those things at face value, if someone does anything to us that is harmful, we should bear under it. And we should not be insubordinate to government officials. And so, okay, where does that leave us then? If we're supposed to obey the law and we're not supposed to retaliate against people who do evil against us, what then is our response? What then is our latitude for obtaining justice? Is God not concerned with the fact that sometimes the people who do evil against us are people who have authority? And if the people who have authority because God gave them authority, does that mean that God is either okay with or is sanctioning the actions of these government officials? Is that the kind of God we serve, where God is tolerant of or even condoning injustice at the highest levels? Or is God concerned with justice being done? I think if we look through the Bible, we'll see that justice is a common theme that runs throughout the Bible. I didn't even have a whole lot of time to look up scripture references for this lesson tonight because I had work to do today. But I was able to find several texts just by a cursory examination of Scripture that have to do with God's concern about justice being done. If we go to Isaiah chapter 5, it says, "Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the ones that are in the right." It's Isaiah 5:22 and 23. God is not pleased with people who justify wickedness and subvert the rights of other people. Staying in Isaiah, go to chapter 10. "Woe to those who enact evil statutes," verse 1, "and who constantly record unjust decisions, so as to deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor of their rights, so that widows may be in their spoil, and that they may plunder the orphans. What will you do on the day of punishment and in the devastation which will come from afar? To whom will you flee, and where will you leave your wealth?" God is concerned about justice. So, if God is concerned about injustice being done, well, the argument, of course, is going to be, well, those are Old Testament texts. And those have to do with Jewish law and the Jewish system of civil government, and God was not tolerant of justice being done there. But now Christianity is separated from civil government. So is God no longer concerned with civil governments being just, especially when, again, you're going to use Romans 13 to say that God is the one who appoints those governments. The question number one is, what is the Old Testament for? Why do we have the Old Testament if we don't use it for doctrinal purposes? Obviously, it doesn't. We're not bound to any of the rules, the laws in the Old Testament, but we have it, and the Bible tells us we have it for our learning. We have it because it gives us the full context of the nature and the person of God. We get to know God more fully, all of the attributes of God, and how he has historically dealt with his people. And because we have the Old Testament, because we can do these studies, we see that God has always been concerned with those in power abusing that power and oppressing those beneath them. And he has often called on his people, his men of God, his prophets, his priests, to stand up and to go to the people in power and tell them what you're doing is not right. And you need to make a correction, or else you will be held accountable. So, if that was the way that God acted and God dealt with people in the past, what makes us think that it's changed today? That we now no longer have the ability and the authority to challenge people in authority? I mean, we can go to a New Testament example if we want to. Uh, Even John the Baptist stood up against Herod and told him, it is not right for you to have your brother's wife. Now, if you want to be technical, John the Baptist still lived in the Old Testament transitional period, so maybe you're not going to count that. We can go to Peter, and as they were thrown in prison, told not to preach in the name of Jesus. As soon as they got out of prison, they were out and preaching again. They defied the authorities. They defied the laws of the land to continue to preach the gospel. We must obey God rather than men. But you want to act as if that's the only exception to that principle, that you need to obey the laws of the land. And this guy's actual argument was, as long as the government allows you to make it to the church building and worship without hassling you, then anything else that they require you to do, anything else that they want to do to you, is fair game, and you should just accept it. I'm trying to, if you're watching on Facebook, you can probably tell that I'm trying to contain my rage at this point. That is not the God I serve. Have you ever heard the expression that you're so focused on heaven that you're no earthly good? There are people who are so concerned with what they consider to be higher spiritual principles that they forget that there are people who have needs here on earth. There are people who are facing problems here on earth. There are people who are facing persecution and oppression and stuff of that nature here on earth. And those people need to know that God cares about their situation. Because if you were to ask these guys we should have done about the whole civil rights aspect, I mean, we came over to this country as slaves from Africa on ships, and there was a movement, an abolitionist movement in the late 1860s that are the late 1800s that set about to change the law to free the slaves and to give us our freedom. And if you were to ask these people, are you glad that we were freed from slavery? Of course, yeah, I'm glad that I'm freed from slavery. I'm glad that I have the opportunity to not be owned by someone else. But if you ask them if you would have been a part of the movement, if you would have done anything to help them, lifted a finger to assist in any way, oh no, that would have been against what God would want us to do. How is something that you think is a good outcome, how is the process of getting to that outcome against the will of God? If the outcome is something that God is pleased with, and of course, the end doesn't always justify the means, and there are things that can be done in furtherance of a quote unquote righteous goal that are in and of themselves unrighteous. But to say that it would be a sin to do anything at all to advance that goal it's way a step too far. Or even the civil rights movement of the next century, of the 1950s and 60s. Martin Luther King. We all hail him as a great man. We say that the movement that he started, that he was fundamental in getting going and making popular, and all the tactics that he used to effectuate positive change in this country. We look at those things as positive changes. We understand that those were great things, and he is lauded for good reasons. But there are, again, those who would say, yeah, we're glad that he did what he did, but of course we wouldn't have helped in any way. What kind of person is it that is willing to reap the benefits of somebody else's labor, but not put a single bit of effort into helping produce that outcome? Is that a positive trait? Is that something that sounds godly? So now, when we have social issues of today, where people are calling out for help, for saying that they are oppressed and they need some sort of justice, and we in our system of government have the power and not only is it lawful for us to speak out against our government, but it is recognized as a fundamental human right that cannot be taken away or suppressed by government. That we have the freedom of speech in this country to call out our rulers. We're not violating the government's laws by doing so. In fact, the government is obligated to defend our right to do so. And yet, there are those who will say there is no place for that. The Christian has no impetus to speak out against those who are oppressing their fellow man, as long as they're not oppressing us, and I can get to the church building. It sounds ridiculous, and that's the problem. You're trying to go and you're trying to talk to somebody about saving their soul and getting them into the church, and yet when they're actually in need of something, when they actually need to see that God, that the church actually cares about their situation, we're nowhere to be found. Why would they want to be a part of an organization like that? Why would they want to serve a God like that? And I know that there are issues today that have framed themselves as civil rights issues, as issues of oppression, that we have fundamental disagreements with. And I'm not saying that you have to be a part of those particular movements, but there are others that are clear violations of humanity, of positive spirituality, that the church should be at the forefront and not on the sidelines. But we want to claim that God, somehow in the New Testament, is no longer concerned with aspects of justice. And James, our Paul says that true religion is to take care of the widow and the fatherless, to provide for them that are in need. And sometimes, I mean, it's easy to say we just need to provide for the people in our sphere that come into our lives that are in need, and we can give them help and that's well and good, and we should do that. But sometimes there are greater things that we could do. There are structures, there are root causes for suffering on a wider scale. And if we have the power, if we have which we do as Americans, to make a change in the root causes that cause those things. And again, I'm not saying that you have to be an activist, that you have to go out and march in the streets or whatever. Maybe marching in the streets is not the wisest thing, especially if you're, again, those types of protests tend to be overtaken by people who are not interested in the cause at all, who just want to cause problems. So maybe that's not the wisest thing you can do, but you can be active in other ways. You can go to city council meetings. You can discuss these issues on your social media. There's nothing wrong with advocating for a better world for people, because when people see that you care about their situation, they're going to be more interested about why do you care? Because God cares. I care because I serve a God that is concerned with justice. And so when there is injustice, I have no choice but to open my mouth. And I get that the fear that this guy that was bringing forth is that there are congregations and there are churches, religious denominations that have become nothing more than social organizations, activist organizations, that their entire theology is to make this country and this earth a utopia through political action. And it's easy to get bogged down and trapped in that cycle, because this world is never going to be a utopia. This world is never going to be perfect for everyone. There's always going to be problems, and Jesus told us that. But to completely ignore suffering because we can't get to perfection, again, that's an extreme position to take, and it's not it's not helpful. Because if people don't think you care about them, then why are they going to want to be attracted to you? Why would they want to come to you? So I leave you with Proverbs chapter 31, verses 8 and 9. And I'll let you draw your conclusions about what would God have us do when we see injustice in our situation. Proverbs 31, 8 and 9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy. The lesson is yours. Thank you guys for your attention, and continue to listen to the Gospel Light radio show.